The temperature in the storage vault remains fixed at 18 degrees Celsius, not cold enough to freeze the past, not warm enough to let it drift. Controlled, calibrated, exact. The sort of environment in which ancient things wait without decaying, and perhaps, if you are patient enough, without falling entirely silent. In the British Museum inside the Department of the Middle East, in a climate-controlled drawer marked with catalog number 1, 8910509.2553, there rests a small cylinder of green stone. Serpentine, barely 4 centimeters high, small enough to disappear in a closed hand, old enough to outlast empires. This is the seal of Ada, and what it shows is difficult to ignore. Its surface was carved in reverse because that is how cylinder seals worked. Rolled across wet clay, the negative became a positive image. A scene appeared, a moment fixed, a statement repeated every time its owner authenticated a tablet, a contract, a record. On this one, several figures stand in arrangement so careful, so deliberate, that even after more than 4,000 years, scholars can still identify them by what they wear, by what they hold, by what emerges from their bodies. On one side, the sun god Shamash rises between 2 mountains. Rays extend from his shoulders. Beside him stands Enki, god of wisdom and of the subterranean waters, and from his shoulders streams flow outward with fish swimming in them. The carving does not suggest water. It shows water. It does not hint at movement. It renders movement. Everything is specific. Everything is placed with confidence. And that is what makes this little object so unsettling. It belongs to the Akkadian period, around 2300 BCE. Yet the artist who cut it understood perspective well enough to order bodies within space proportion, well enough to distinguish rank and identity and symbolic language, well enough to create an image still readable after 4 millennia. These are not crude forms. These are not vague emblems. They are portrayals. The gods are not distant. They are not dissolved into abstraction. They are present in a scene, engaged in an event occupying space. And the seal of Ada is not alone. Across museum vaults in London, Paris, Berlin, Baghdad, Philadelphia, and elsewhere, other objects wait in their drawers and cases. Cylinder seals showing divine figures standing beside humans. Reliefs depicting gods inside battles rather than above them. Statues inscribed with accounts of dreams in which building plans were given by beings the Sumerians called the Anunnaki. Clay tablets recording instructions, genealogies, decisions, and conversations. 2 records survive side by side, one visual, one textual, stone and clay, image and word. And again they say the same thing. So the question is not whether the Sumerians believed in the Anunnaki. That question is settled. Their texts leave no uncertainty there. They did believe in them. They named them. They described them. They placed them at the center of origins, kingship judgment, labor war, and civilization itself. The deeper question is something else. Something academic language often approaches carefully. Something usually softened with qualifications. Something that makes conventional timelines uneasy. What if the Sumerians were not creating mythology? What if they were keeping records? Before dismissing that question, and many people do dismiss it, it is worth staying with the evidence itself a little longer. Not theories, not speculation, layered on speculation, not late fantasies about ancient astronauts or modern conspiracies, just the artifacts, just the tablets, just the carved stone, just the things that exist and can be seen. Because this is not, at least not yet, about believing anything unusual. It is about reading what the Sumerians actually wrote. It is about looking carefully at what they actually carved. It is about asking why there is such consistency between those two records. When they speak about beings, the Sumerians insisted were real, present, and foundational. Why does the seal show what the text describes? Why does the text describe what the art shows? Why do the same names, the same attributes, the same relationships recur with such steadiness? That is the path we are going to follow. We will look at specific objects. The War Vase, among the earliest narrative artworks in human history. Cylinder seals that served as signatures rolled into contracts and letters carrying scenes of humans before gods. The stelae of the vultures, where divine power does not merely witness war, but appears to enter it. The Gudea cylinders, where a ruler receives architectural plans in a dream and records the process with almost technical precision. The descent texts, in which the Anunnaki sit as judges in the underworld. And throughout, we will keep returning to the same central uncertainty. Not because repetition is inefficient, but because some questions need to be approached more than once. Were these stories, or were they records? Were the gods symbolic, or were they remembered? If you are listening from somewhere quiet tonight, from a city apartment, a night shift, a bedroom lit only by a screen, you may already feel the sort of stillness in which those questions begin to matter. And perhaps that matters too. These investigations do not unfold well in noise. They unfold in patience, in long attention, in the willingness to keep looking after certainty fails. The investigation has to begin, though not with the gods, but with the people who wrote about them. Before asking what the Sumerians recorded, we need to ask how we know what they recorded at all. We need to understand who they were, where they lived, how their civilization was discovered, and how their lost language was read again after 2,000 years of silence. The story begins in southern Mesopotamia, the land between the Tigris and Euphrates. A place of silt marsh river water, heat and astonishing firsts. A place where 5,000 years ago, something happened that still feels abrupt when we look back at it through the archaeological record. Civilization appeared there with a suddenness that still troubles explanation. Not villages very slowly becoming towns, and towns very slowly becoming cities over unbroken millennia in plain view, but cities, monumental architecture, administration, writing, irrigation, specialized labor, complex economy, a society already behaving like a civilization. The mainstream explanation is familiar. Agricultural surplus allowed concentration of population. Population concentration allowed specialization. Specialization required administration. Administration required records. Records became writing. It is a reasonable explanation, and parts of the evidence clearly support it. But the Sumerians themselves told the story differently. That difference matters, because they did not say, "We gradually invented civilization." They said civilization was given. They did not describe trial and error stretching invisibly across countless generations. They described transfer, instruction, bestowal, the arts of kingship writing, metalwork, architecture, law, music, pottery, and ordered society were not merely discovered. They were received. That claim, whether mythological or historical, lies at the center of everything that follows. And to understand why they made it, we have to go back to the beginning, to the first cities, to the first names, and to the old Sumerian memory of a time when heaven and earth were not yet fully separate. Southern Mesopotamia was shaped by water before it was shaped by stone. The Tigris and Euphrates came down from the mountains carrying snowmelt and silt into what is now Iraq, spreading out into marshland and fertile plains before reaching the Gulf. 5,000 years ago, that landscape was not exactly the one we know from modern maps. The coastline sat differently. The marshes reached farther. The whole region breathed with river change. And in that mutable land, something happened that remains one of the great turning points in human history. Around 3,500 BCE, within what archaeologists still describe as a relatively compressed span of time, urban civilization in southern Mesopotamia appears with startling force. Uruk rises. Administrative centers emerge. Monumental structures are built. Labor is organized. Water is managed. Writing begins. A world that had been composed of settlements becomes a world of cities. This matters, and it matters slowly, because when we say civilization began, we often imagine a long, smooth gradient, as though one form of life almost imperceptibly became another. But the evidence in Mesopotamia does not feel smooth. It feels abrupt, not magical, not inexplicable, but abrupt. As though some threshold was crossed quickly enough that later observers would always feel a little uncertain about where the earlier preparation ended and the visible result began. Mainstream archaeology explains the change through intensification. Irrigation made the land more productive. Surplus grain meant not everyone had to farm. Some became potters, scribes, builders, priests, merchants, administrators. Complexity generated more complexity. The system fed itself. Records became necessary. Symbols became lists. Lists became writing. Yes. Up to a point, yes. The earliest surviving tablets from Uruk are in fact administrative. Grain allotments, livestock counts, labor assignments, mundane records, not poems. Bureaucracy before mythology, at least, in what survives. And that is important because it grounds the Sumerians in practical life. They were not dreamers floating above reality. They counted sheep. They tracked grain. They measured work. But when the Sumerians looked backward and described the origin of their civilization, they did not narrate it as a gradual administrative triumph. They narrated it as a gift. They used a term for the fundamental powers or principles of civilization, me. Writing was a me. Kingship was a me. Temple ritual was a me. Metalworking, leatherworking, music craftsmanship, rule, truth, social order, all of these belong to the category. The me were not vague ideals. They were specific capacities that made civilization possible. And according to the Sumerian texts, these emmi belonged first to the gods, most centrally to Enki, god of wisdom, watercraft, and cunning. Enki possessed them. Enki distributed them. Enki transmitted them. In one famous composition, Inanna travels to Eridu, feasts with Enki, and carries the me away to Uruk. However that poem is interpreted politically, ritually, Mythologically, the structure is the same. Civilization moves as something transferable. It is held possessed, given stolen, carried. It does not simply emerge from nowhere. That is not a small difference in worldview. The modern explanatory model says humans developed civilization through cumulative social adaptation. The Sumerian memory says civilization was bestowed. The modern model says knowledge accumulated. The Sumerian memory says knowledge was transferred. And again, the question returns not as accusation, not as conclusion, but as a quiet pressure beneath the evidence. Why would a people describe their beginnings this way if their actual lived memory was only one of slow, local, incremental development? Why would they choose sudden instruction as their origin pattern? Why not say simply that their ancestors learned, experimented, improved? There are answers, perhaps because cultures mythologize their beginnings, perhaps because divine gifts make stronger foundation stories than patient trial and error. Perhaps because rulers and priests benefited from attributing social order to divine authority. All of that is reasonable. But there is another possibility as well. Perhaps they describe transfer because that is what their inherited memory contained. We cannot decide that from one text. We cannot decide it from a phrase. But we can notice how consistently the pattern appears. Again and again, the Anunnaki and related divine figures are described as sources of the knowledge that formed settled civilization. The chronological sequence reconstructed by archaeology is worth holding alongside that memory. The Ubaid period, roughly 6,500 to 3,800 BCE, shows settled agricultural communities, villages, pottery, basic craft specialization. Then the Uruk period, around 4,000 to 3,100 BCE, shows the leap into large-scale urbanization. Monumentality, administration, proto-writing. Then the early dynastic period from around 2900 to 2334 BCE, when Sumerian city-states such as Uruk-Lagash, Nippur-Kish, and others flourish, compete, consolidate, and leave the dense visual and textual record we are still reading. Then the Akkadian Empire, then later dynasties, then the slow absorption of Sumerian language into scholarly and ritual use, even after it ceased to be spoken. And through all of that change, the deep structure of the stories remains strangely stable. The names of the gods persist. Their relationships persist. Their roles persist. The Anunnaki remain. Enki remains Enki. Inanna remains Inanna. Shamash remains identifiable. Genealogies are preserved. Attributes are preserved. This is not what mythology always does. Mythologies shift, merge, split, absorb, and transform. That happens in Mesopotamia too, of course. But beneath the political changes and linguistic changes, there is still a remarkable continuity. Which raises the question once more from a different angle. Is this merely theological conservatism, or is it archival fidelity? Were these stories preserved because they were sacred, or because they were remembered as historical? The Sumerians even had different ways of speaking about the past. There were days of old, ancient days. And then there was the time of first things, the age when humanity first appeared. It is in that deeper category that the Anunnaki are placed. Not casually, not poetically alone, but genealogically, chronologically, structurally. When 19th century archaeologists first began recovering Mesopotamian civilization, none of this was expected. British and French excavators were often looking for biblical cities, biblical kings, biblical confirmation. At Nineveh, Nimrud, and elsewhere, they found great palaces, reliefs, and above all, tablets covered in wedge-shaped signs. Cuneiform, the oldest writing system known. The first breakthroughs in decipherment came through multilingual inscriptions like Behistun, where Old Persian Elamite and Akkadian appeared side by side. Raw courage and patient comparison opened the first doors. Henry Rawlinson and others cracked Akkadian first. Then something stranger emerged. Akkadian texts contained glosses in an older language. Scribal lists preserved words from that older language. Temple scholarship had preserved it after everyday speech had abandoned it. That language was Sumerian. The discovery changed history. Suddenly there was a civilization older than Assyria, older than Babylon, older than the biblical empires. A civilization that had built cities, invented writing, developed mathematics, law, administration, and literature, while much of the rest of the world, as then understood, remained in far simpler forms of social organization. And the deeper archaeologists dug, the more unsettling the pattern became. Sophistication appeared early. The War Vase, early cylinder seals, refined craftsmanship, administrative complexity, literary possibility waiting inside the script. Things did not look like primitive experiments. They looked like mature systems already functioning. Mainstream archaeology reasonably infers earlier developmental stages not yet found or poorly preserved. That may be correct. It is often the safest explanation. But it is still an inference. It is development assumed because sophistication is visible. The Sumerians themselves did not infer their own development that way. They stated where their civilization came from. From the gods, from the Anunnaki, from Enki, from the sages before the flood, from heaven to earth. We are not yet deciding whether that statement is literal. We are only noticing that they made it repeatedly and with a steadiness difficult to wave away. And before we can go further, we have to understand one more thing. Not just the civilization, not just the chronology, but the language itself. Because the deepest clues may not lie only in what the Sumerians said, but in the exact words they chose when they said it. Picture a clay tablet in a scribe's hands. Thick, damp, heavier than a modern phone, shaped by fingers from river clay mixed with straw so it will hold its form as it dries. The scribe sits in shade. He does not draw letters in ink. He presses impressions into clay with a reed stylus cut to a wedge. Each touch leaves a mark. Marks become signs. Signs become words. Words become records, lists, hymns, contracts, royal inscriptions, temple inventories, genealogies, laments, myths, instructions. That is cuneiform. For 2,000 years, no one could read it. The last cuneiform texts were written in late Babylon, and after that, the knowledge faded until the script became only pattern on ruins, mute wedges on broken tablets. Medieval observers saw the marks and did not know what they were. Some assumed decoration. Others saw only mystery without method. The language died so completely that when Europe rediscovered the script, it first had to rediscover the possibility that the marks were language at all. The great turning point came with the Behistun inscription in Iran, carved high on a cliff face, repeating the same royal text in 3 languages. By comparing known names in Old Persian to the other inscriptions, scholars began assigning sounds to signs. It was dangerous work before it was scholarly work. Henry Rawlinson copied parts of the inscription while hanging from ropes against the rock face. That physical courage, almost absurdly old-fashioned by modern standards, opened the door to a lost world. Akkadian yielded first. A Semitic language related broadly to Hebrew and Arabic, difficult but not utterly alien in structure. Yet within Akkadian texts appeared something older, strange glosses, unfamiliar word lists, a deeper layer. The scribes themselves had studied it the way medieval scholars studied Latin. That deeper layer was Sumerian. And Sumerian was startling because it belonged to no known language family, not Semitic, not Indo-European, an isolate, grammatically rich, agglutinative compact, and already sophisticated in the earliest texts we possess. The more scholars reconstructed it through bilingual word lists, glossaries, school tablets, and later explanations, the more it became clear that the oldest literature in the world had been waiting there all along. And among the many terms recovered from that clay, one returns with particular force: Anunnaki. The word matters because every translation is also a choice of frame. In cuneiform, the term appears in forms that scholars interpret differently depending on context and philological preference. The standard academic translation usually points towards something like princely seed or offspring of Anu, identifying the Anunnaki as a class of divine beings related to the sky god Anu. That is the conventional and cautious dual rendering. It keeps the term within mythology. It treats the beings as members of a divine genealogy. But there has long been another way of reading the components, one less preferred in mainstream scholarship, but difficult to ignore once noticed those who from heaven to earth came. That alternative reading shifts only a little in grammar and immensely in implication. In one version, the term emphasizes descent and rank. In the other, it emphasizes movement, not who they were in a family tree, but what they did. They came. Mainstream Assyriology prefers the genealogical reading. And there are good reasons for that. It is methodologically conservative. It fits known divine structures. It avoids overreaching. Yet even if the conventional translation is correct, the texts themselves still repeatedly place the Anunnaki in narratives of arrival labor administration judgment and participation in the early ordering of the world. So, translation alone does not close the question. Take the Atrahasis tradition. There, the Anunnaki are associated with work, hard work, digging canals, maintaining systems. Labor before humanity. Their complaint about labor becomes the reason humans are created. That detail is peculiar if we imagine the Anunnaki only as lofty, divine offspring. Why manual labor? Why grievance? Why collective complaint about physical burden? The text reads less like abstract theology and more like social hierarchy under strain. Or take Inanna's Descent, where the Anunnaki sit as judges in the underworld. Again, a collective with assigned role. Not random divine atmosphere. Not generalized holiness. An organized body with authority. Or the creation passages where humans are made so that the gods may be at ease. The labor problem appears again. Humans serve as relief. Whatever one thinks of these texts, the Anunnaki are not passive symbols. They function. Another term matters too: Dinger. Usually translated simply as God or divine, it is marked in cuneiform by a star sign. That star sign is important. It means the term carried associations not only of godhood in the abstract, but of brightness, height, celestial relation, perhaps shining quality. When danger appears before names such as Enki or Inanna, translators render it as the god Enki, the goddess Inanna. Fair enough. But it remains true that the original marker is also visually celestial. Star, brightness, heaven. Again, the point is not to force an exotic reading only to avoid pretending translation is neutral. When we say God, we place the being inside our category. When the Sumerians used Dingir, they place the being inside theirs. And their category may not overlap neatly with ours. The same is true of the mythos powers or principles of civilization. Modern scholarship often treats them as abstract cultural essences. Yet in the poem of Inanna and Enki, the Emi are handled like transferable objects, loaded, carried, taken by boat, retrieved, or attempted to be retrieved. That does not prove they were physical devices. It does, however, make a purely abstract reading feel incomplete. The texts treat them with a concreteness unusual for mere ideas. So once more the tension returns. Were these metaphors for social power or descriptions of something more tangible? Scholarship deserves respect here. These languages are difficult. These texts are hard-won. Generations of Assyriologists reconstructed them carefully and responsibly. But expertise in language and certainty about ultimate meaning are not identical. A translator can know what the words say and still remain uncertain about what the experience behind the words was. That is where the humility has to remain. The Sumerians wrote that these beings came, worked, judged, taught, organized, and withdrew. They describe them not with one isolated phrase, but across multiple compositions spanning centuries. If all of this is mythology, it is unusually coherent mythology. If it is memory preserved with striking discipline. And then there is the visual record. Because once you have listened to the words closely, the images begin to speak differently. A horned crown stops being merely decorative. Streams of water stop being merely emblematic. Rays from shoulders stop being merely ornamental. The gods in Sumerian art are not blank, divine shapes. They are identifiable individuals with stable attributes. That stability matters. If you were creating an artistic system to help worshippers recognize the gods, you would do exactly this. You would standardize signs. You would assign features. You would teach an iconography. But if you were preserving descriptions of beings who were believed to have been seen, you would also do exactly this. That is the difficulty, and perhaps the fascination. The art does not release us from ambiguity, it deepens it. Before we reach the small personal seals and the reliefs of battle, we need to pause at one of the oldest narrative images ever carved, the War Vase. Because in that alabaster vessel from Uruk, over 5,000 years old, a pattern appears already complete. Human labor rising in procession, goods moving upward, a figure identified as divine standing at the end of the line, not absent, not far away, but receiving. And in that receiving, the old question begins again: presence or symbol? Ceremony or record? In the Iraq Museum in Baghdad, object M19606 stands as one of the oldest surviving narrative artworks in human history. The War Vase, carved from alabaster just over a meter high, found at Uruk in the sacred precinct associated with Inanna, dates to roughly 3,200 to 3,000 BCE. It was discovered in fragments, reconstructed from many pieces stolen during the looting of the museum in 2003, and returned months later, damaged, but recoverable. It survived loss, violence, and return. It survived long enough for us to keep asking what it shows. And what it shows is a procession. The vase is organized in horizontal bands, registers that rise from bottom to top. The eye moves upward through a world already ordered. At the bottom are wavy lines of water and carefully rendered plants. Barley, reeds, date palms, not wilderness, not untamed growth. Cultivated life. Nature already organized into agriculture. Water already serving order. Above that appear animals, sheep and cattle moving in line. Again, not wild, herded, directed, incorporated into the economy of a settled world. Above them come the humans, naked men moving in procession, carrying baskets, jars, goods produced from labor. They are not standing still, they are bringing. The whole relief pushes toward delivery, toward offering, toward transfer from one level of order to the next. And then, at the top, the destination. A large figure stands there, larger than the others, in the way ancient Near Eastern art often indicates importance. Beside the figure are the unmistakable emblems of Inanna, the reed ring standards that identify her sacred domain. Before her, a smaller male figure, often read as ruler or priest, advances with offerings. Behind him, attendants continue the movement of goods. This is usually interpreted as a ritual scene, a temple offering, perhaps even the sacred marriage rite in which king and goddess, or king and priestess as the goddess's embodied representative, participate in a ritual that secures fertility and legitimacy. That interpretation is plausible, more than plausible. It fits what we know of Uruk temple culture, temple economy, and royal ideology. But it is worth asking slowly what the vase literally depicts before we decide what it means. It depicts cultivated land giving rise to animals. Animals and agriculture giving rise to human labor. Human labor bringing goods. Goods being delivered directly to a figure identified as divine. That is the sequence. And in the scene itself, the divine figure is not absent, not in heaven, not behind a veil, not represented only by a symbol. She stands there at the point of reception. There is a transaction taking place in shared space. This matters because later religious art in many traditions often separates divine and human spheres more sharply. The divine may hover above, appear inside halos, occupy another realm, or be represented symbolically rather than bodily. But here at the dawn of urban civilization, the image does something more immediate. It places the human and the divine inside the same visual field, participating in the same event. Mainstream scholarship answers the obvious objection quite reasonably. Of course, the divine appears physically here because ritual itself is physical. A priestess could embody Inanna. A cult image could stand in her place. A ceremony requires bodies. The relief depicts the ritual reality, not necessarily a literal God standing there. Yes, that is a strong explanation. But even within that explanation, the underlying pattern remains striking. The relationship between human labor and divine authority is imagined as direct. Not only conceptually direct, but visually direct. Goods are not left beneath the sky for an invisible abstraction. They are brought into the presence of a known receiver. and that same pattern will return again and again. The War Vase does something else as well. It establishes hierarchy through size. The workers are smallest. The ritual intermediary is larger. The divine figure is largest. In ancient art, that is usually read as symbolic scale, not literal height. Importance is enlarged. Rank is magnified. Probably that is what happens here. Probably. And yet the question lingers because later Mesopotamian literature does describe certain kings and divine beings as physically extraordinary. Gilgamesh is larger than ordinary men. The antediluvian rulers possess impossible lifespans. Divine human hybrids appear in traditions not only in Mesopotamia, but far beyond it. If a culture remembered some beings as larger, stronger, longer-lived symbolic scale in art might preserve status and memory at once. That is not proof. It is simply one more point where the line between symbol and recollection becomes less tidy than we might like. The War Vase likely served a ceremonial function. It may have stood in the temple precinct as part of ritual display. It taught a message every time it was seen. Order rises upward. Labor serves the temple. The temple mediates access to the divine. Prosperity depends on right relation. Whether that right relation was theological, political, economic, or all three at once, the message was unmistakable. The gods were not imagined as indifferent. They were involved, they received, they stood at the center of the system. And that point is easy to miss if we read too quickly. The vase does not merely glorify worship. It organizes reality. It tells you how the world works. Water, crops, herds, labor, offering, divine reception, a chain of dependence, a civilization flowing toward a presence. Again, if one wants to read all this symbolically, that is entirely possible. The figure of Inanna may stand for the temple institution itself. The reception of goods may describe redistribution under sacred authority. The whole image may be a compact theology of social order. But if one suspends the assumption of symbolism for just a moment, the image can also be read as documentation of relationship. Humans deliver resources to a being or office understood as literally connected to a present divine power. The distinction matters even if the evidence does not yet let us settle it, because this is where the recurring question returns from another angle. What does a civilization carve when it wants to show what matters most? The answer here is not a mountain, not a storm, not a cosmic abstraction. It carves a procession ending in delivery to a divine figure standing in shared space. And that is why the War Vase matters so much. It appears at the beginning, before later theology becomes more layered, before later literature becomes more explicit, before the long textual tradition unfolds fully. Already the visual grammar is in place. Humans and gods interact physically. The divine is knowable through attributes. Social order is inseparable from sacred presence. This is the beginning of a visual language that will continue for millennia. The monumental image gives us a ceremonial scene, public and formal. But the next body of evidence brings the same logic into ordinary life, into contracts, ownership, administration, personal identity. Cylinder seals were not monumental state art. They were small, intimate, carried objects, personal things. And when people chose the scenes that would stand for them, what they repeatedly chose is telling. They chose to place themselves before gods. They chose to authenticate transactions through images of divine proximity, which means the next step in this investigation is smaller in scale, but in some ways more revealing. Because if the War Vase shows how a civilization represented cosmic order publicly, the cylinder seals show how individuals imagined their place inside that order and how close they believed the divine could come. Imagine a merchant in Mesopotamia around 2400 BCE. A contract has been negotiated. Grain, livestock, labor, dates, penalties, obligations, witnesses. The agreement is pressed into clay. But writing alone is not enough. Identity must be attached. Authority must be marked. And so, the merchant reaches to his belt or his neck and draws out a tiny cylinder of carved stone. He rolls it across the damp tablet. The scene appears. That scene is not merely decorative. It is signature identity legitimacy, and in many cases, something more than all three. Because Mesopotamian cylinder seals do not simply mark ownership, they place the owner in relation to the divine. Thousands of these seals survive. In the British Museum, the Louvre, Berlin, Philadelphia, Yale, and many other collections, they sit in drawers and display cases, each one a compressed world, worn close to the body, used in daily life, pressed again and again into legal and economic documents. And the recurring images they bear are difficult to dismiss as incidental. Humans stand before gods. Humans are introduced to gods. Humans receive symbols from gods. Gods stand beside humans, witness agreements preside over exchange sanction authority. Return to the seal of Ada, the object that opened this investigation. Tiny green Akkadian exquisite. When rolled out, it shows a cluster of deities in one frame. Shamash rising between mountains, rays from his shoulders. Enki with streams of water and fish. Other identifiable divine figures in attendance. At the edge, a worshipper and the inscription naming Ada, the scribe. This was not a temple wall, not a state monument. This was Ada's personal seal, his identity, his professional mark, his visual statement about himself in relation to the divine. That matters. Because if a monumental state object depicts gods that may tell us what a ruling order wants seen, but if private seals do the same thing over and over across centuries, cities, and professions, then divine proximity was not only public ideology, it was woven into ordinary transactions. These scenes are often called presentation scenes. A human figure, usually smaller, is led before a seated deity by an intermediary divine figure or protective personal deity. The human raises a hand in reverence. The great deity sits enthroned. Sometimes there is an offering table. Sometimes there are symbols above the scene. Sometimes rod and ring appear. The formulas recur with astonishing regularity. Scholarly interpretation is straightforward and sensible. These show devotion. They visualize a relationship of piety. The seal owner imagines himself presented before the deity whose favor he seeks. It is a ritual aspiration in pictorial form. Yes, that reading works. But once again, if we pause and ask only what is depicted, the answer is more concrete. Access, introduction, court protocol. The intermediary does not bridge infinite metaphysical distance. The intermediary behaves like an official bringing someone into audience. The god sits like a ruler. The supplicant stands close enough to be received. The structure resembles royal court ceremony because that is exactly what it resembles. as though divine authority was imagined not as abstract omnipresence, but as audience, as though the gods held court, as though humans could approach. That does not prove such audiences happened physically, but it does reveal how physically the idea was conceived. And then there is the iconography itself. It is systematic. Horned crowns identify divinity. Water and fish identify Enki. Rays identify Shamash. Lions identify Inanna or Ishtar. Weapons rise from shoulders. Distinctive postures recur. This is a visual language so stable that scholars can identify deities across wide spans of time from attributes alone. That degree of standardization can be explained through religious tradition. Certainly, it can also be read as preservation of recognizable appearances. If a culture believed that particular beings had been seen remembered, described, and handed down, consistent visual markers would emerge naturally. The key point is not which explanation is correct. The key point is that the evidence supports both. Consider seals sometimes cited controversially, like VA243 in Berlin. Popular fringe interpretation has long claimed that the stars on such seals depict advanced astronomical knowledge, or even a solar system far beyond ancient capacity. Mainstream scholarship rejects that reading, and rightly so in its stronger forms. The star signs are standard divine markers. They do not prove impossible astronomy. But strip away the sensationalism and look again at the scene itself. A deity, a human agricultural symbolism transfer relationship. Even without the extravagant claims imposed on it, the seal still participates in the larger pattern civilization's tools, and powers are represented as moving from divine to human hands. That is the important part. Again and again, the seals show not distant adoration, but interaction. Gods handing objects, gods receiving worshippers, gods standing in scenes of transaction and witness. If this were only a theology of transcendence, one might expect more distance, more sky, more separation, more symbols alone. But Mesopotamian art repeatedly chooses closeness. And because these seals belong to actual people and were used in actual bureaucratic life, their imagery tells us something about how embedded that closeness was in social reality. Not necessarily empirical reality in the modern sense, but lived reality, civilizational reality, the kind of reality a culture acts from. This is why cylinder seals are such powerful evidence. They are not isolated masterpieces. They are repeated habits of representation. Hundreds, thousands, a whole civilization pressing the same kind of visual assumptions into clay documents day after day. The divine is present. The divine is identifiable. The divine can witness, authorize, introduce, and receive. That is the world these seals assume. And the pattern grows even more dramatic when we move from private identity to public conflict. Because if seals show gods in audience, and exchange monumental war art shows gods in violence, not merely blessing battle from a distance, but entering its space, holding weapons, trapping enemies, deciding outcomes with physical force. There, the imagery becomes harder still to reduce to abstraction, or at least harder to reduce without residue. So the next stage of the evidence asks a sharper question. What does it mean when a civilization depicts its gods not merely as objects of prayer, but as combatants? What does it mean when divine figures appear not above war, but inside it? The answer begins with one of the most striking monuments from early Mesopotamia, broken now into fragments, but still severe enough to force attention. The Stele of the Vultures. In the Louvre, among the Mesopotamian collections, fragments of limestone preserve the remains of a victory monument from around 2450 BCE. It is called the Stele of the Vultures, named for the birds shown carrying severed heads and limbs across the battlefield. Its original height would have made it imposing. Even now in fragments, it is difficult to stand before it without feeling that something very direct survives in the stone. The monument commemorates the victory of Anunnaki of Lagash over the neighboring city-state of Umma. A border conflict, irrigation rights, territory. One more war in the long history of settled people competing over land and water. That much is ordinary. What is less ordinary is how the monument explains the victory. On one fragment appears Ningirsu, patron god of Lagash, immense in scale, wearing the horned crown of divinity. He holds a great net. Inside the net are human enemies, their bodies trapped, compressed, helpless. In his other hand, he raises a mace. At his feet lie the defeated. This is not a god hovering as abstraction. This is a god engaged in capture and killing. The accompanying inscription makes the point explicit. Ningirsu set the great net for Umma. Ningirsu struck them down. Specific casualties are named. Numbers are given. Treaty violations are described. Human politics and divine violence are interwoven. Here again, mainstream interpretation offers a coherent answer. The stele is propaganda. Of course it is propaganda. Every victory monument is propaganda. The god represents divine sanction. The divine net symbolizes military strategy, cosmic justice, the inevitable triumph of the rightful city. The image magnifies political legitimacy through religious language. Yes, very likely. And yet even propaganda reveals its own assumptions. If Eannatum wanted only to claim divine approval, he could have shown Ningirsu above the battle watching, blessing, endorsing. Instead, the monument shows direct intervention. The god is physically acting upon the enemy. Why choose that form? Why insist on participation rather than distant support? Because that evidently was a plausible thing to claim. And plausibility matters. A culture does not make every imaginable claim equally. It makes the claims its symbolic world can carry. If the Mesopotamians repeatedly depicted gods in battle as active agents, that tells us something about the kind of divine presence they found thinkable. The same pattern appears in literary tradition. In the Epic of Gilgamesh, gods provide weapons-issue commands. Send the bull of heaven, deliberate over punishment. Ishtar appears, speaks, threatens. Anu relents. The bull descends. Gilgamesh and Enkidu fight it. The sequence is narrated as event, not as distant spiritual allegory. Even where we read it as myth, the mode is concrete. Bodies move, weapons strike, councils gather, sentences are issued. Mesopotamian divine life behaves politically and physically. That is worth repeating because it returns so often that repetition itself becomes evidence of structure. Mesopotamian divine life behaves politically and physically, not as pure philosophical principle, not as inaccessible transcendence, but as hierarchy, conflict, labor, judgment, strategy, response. And when the gods appear in war imagery, they appear with the same visual conventions used elsewhere. The horned crown means the same thing. The weapon is rendered like a weapon. The human dead are rendered like human dead. Nothing in the visual language announces, "This part is metaphor." The scene reads, at least formally, as documentation. Again, that does not mean it is documentation in the modern historical sense. It means the monument chooses the grammar of event. The standard of Ur deepens the pattern differently. Discovered in the royal cemetery at Ur and dating to around 2600 BCE, it presents on one side a war scene and on the other a feast. The war side shows chariots, infantry prisoners, crushed bodies, rank, and procession. At the top stands the ruler, larger than others, receiving captives. Above, or within the highest zone, appear divine emblems linked to the powers under whose sanction violence becomes meaningful. The standard does not show a free-floating meditation on conflict. It shows organized warfare under divine order. Gods and kings, power and legitimacy, territory and sacred structure. Once more, war is not merely human. It is folded into a larger hierarchy. The question then is not whether religion and politics were intertwined. They clearly were. The question is how literally the Mesopotamians themselves understood that intertwining. Did they believe gods participated because myth and statecraft were inseparable? Or did they believe gods participated because gods, in some sense meaningful to them, actually had? The same question returns because the evidence keeps forcing it back. Myth or memory symbol or record. And sometimes the texts make the problem sharper by giving divine actions the texture of practical detail. In myths of Ninurta's battles, weapons report intelligence. Strategies are described. Rivers are redirected. Stones are named. Terrain changes. These could be poetic expansions of divine warfare. They could also be inherited ways of speaking about large-scale interventions, engineering, or environmental control using the only available language. That may sound like overreading. It may be, but it is impossible not to notice how often Sumerian and Akkadian texts describe divine acts with verbs that are stubbornly practical. Build, dig, cut, divide, assign, measure, lift, establish. The gods in these texts do not merely symbolize order, they perform tasks. And if there is one place where that practical quality becomes almost impossible to miss, it is in the inscriptions of Gudea, ruler of Lagash, who claimed that a god showed him a building plan in a dream. Not a vague inspiration, not a feeling, a plan, with materials, measurements, sources, sequence, construction. There, the old boundary between religious vision and technical instruction becomes especially thin. And so the investigation moves from battlefield to blueprint, from net and mace to temple plan, from gods at war to gods as architects. Gudea ruled Lagash during the Neo-Sumerian period, around 2144 to 2124 BCE. He left behind not one inscription, not one statue, but many. The Louvre alone preserves numerous statues of him, seated or standing, hands clasped, face composed, body, wrapped in the long garment of rulership and devotion. These statues were not casual memorials. They were statements placed in temples, repeated testimony in stone. And among the most revealing testimonies associated with Gudea are the great clay cylinders known as Cylinder A and Cylinder B long texts, inscribed with cuneiform and devoted to the construction of the temple of Ningirsu, the Ininu. The story begins with difficulty. The rituals are not working. Prosperity is withheld. The gods seem distant. Gudea seeks understanding. He purifies himself. He prays. And then he dreams. In the dream, a figure appears. The description is unusually specific. A man enormous. By his crown, a god. By his wings, the Anzu bird. By his lower body, a flood wave. A complex composite presence, not easily understood. Beside him or after him appear other figures, also distinct a woman carrying a golden stylus and holding a tablet of stars, a warrior, an impatient donkey beside a chariot. Images vivid enough to remain strange, even inside the text itself. And Gudea does not understand them. That matters. Because if this were simple propaganda, one might expect clarity. The god appears, identifies himself, gives command, the pious ruler obeys. But the first dream is confusing. Gudea needs interpretation. He goes to Nanshe goddess associated with dreams and divination and tells her what he saw. She explains it. The great figure was Ningirsu. The woman with the star tablet was Nisaba. The warrior was a protective deity. The donkey signified urgency. Then a second dream follows, and in that second dream, the instructions become more detailed. The temple is to be built. Materials are named. Measurements are specified. Wood types are listed. Stone sources are identified. Ritual timing is fixed. Construction sequence is laid out. The level of specificity is remarkable. Cedar from the Amonis, diorite from Magan, metals and stones from known trade regions, real materials from real places. The text reads with the strange precision of something halfway between liturgy and engineering record. Mainstream interpretation, again, is available sober and strong. Gudea is legitimizing a massive public works project. Temple building required labor resources, political authority, and economic concentration. Claiming divine command sanctified the effort. The dream narrative provided theological grounding. The detailed descriptions demonstrated piety and administrative competence, certainly. And yet once more, before resting inside interpretation, it is worth asking what the text actually presents. A ruler sees a figure. The figure shows or indicates a plan. The ruler does not fully understand. He seeks expert interpretation. Further instruction follows. The ruler then builds according to those specifications, and the finished structure corresponds to the recorded plan. This could be a literary dramatization of temple planning. It could be genuine dream experience later woven into state ideology. It could be propaganda built on real technical preparation. And if one allows the possibility, however provisionally, that the Sumerians sometimes wrote from remembered contact rather than from symbolic imagination alone, it could also be read as instruction delivered from a non-human source through a form of mediated vision. The evidence does not compel that last reading, but it does not allow us to dismiss why it becomes thinkable. Because the details are stubborn. The text does not say simply, "A God inspired me." It says, "The plan was shown. The materials were named. The celestial timing was indicated. The building was erected." That concreteness matters. The statues of Gudea themselves reinforce the pattern. Some show him holding on his lap what appears to be a plan or measuring board. Geometry, alignment, design rule. Again, this can be read symbolically. Gudea as builder, king, orderly, ruler, pious patron. Of course it can. But the visual and textual records together still emphasize the same thing: knowledge is received and then implemented. And when excavation later revealed, the temple remains the text did not dissolve into pure fantasy. They described an actual project. Foundations lay out dedicatory structures. The temple was built. The record corresponds to reality. That does not prove divine instruction. It proves that the text documenting divine instruction is attached to an actual realized architectural program. The line between myth and administrative memory blurs. This blurring is not unique to Gudea, but with Gudea it is unusually visible. Across ancient civilizations, temple construction is often linked to revelation. Sacred architecture arrives through dream command, heavenly pattern, or shown design. In biblical tradition, too, temple plans descend from God through chosen figures. In Egypt, the same logic appears. Monumental sacred building is very often narrated as a reception rather than invention. Why? One answer is simple. The sacred must come from above to be legitimate below. Another answer is more provocative because major architectural knowledge was in fact believed to have been given, not generated. Whether that belief was symbolic truth or remembered fact remains the dividing line. And perhaps that line is harder to hold than we think, because human experience itself often works this way. Technical insight can come through dreams. Solutions can appear in vision. Planning and revelation are not absolute opposites. A ruler may genuinely dream, genuinely believe, and still act politically. Reality is not obliged to fit our neat categories. Still, the Gudea cylinders intensify the central question. If this is mythology, it is mythology with measurements. If it is political theology, it is political theology with logistics. If it is a record, it is a record preserving one of the most detailed accounts of divine human instruction in the ancient world. And Gudea's texts do not end with planning. They end with occupation. The temple is completed. Rituals are performed. Ningirsu enters his house. The phrasing matters. The god enters, takes residence, settles in. The temple is not only symbolic architecture, it is habitation prepared for a presence. Again, perhaps that presence meant a cult statue, a ritual embodiment, a sacred locus. That is the conventional reading. But the Sumerian phrasing still imagines arrival, entry, occupancy. The temple is for use, for contact, for inhabitation by the divine. This is why Mesopotamian religion feels less like abstract metaphysics and more like administration of relationship. Gods have houses. Gods receive goods. Gods require service. Gods issue plans. Gods dwell somewhere and are attended. That pattern, once seen, becomes hard to unsee, and it continues beyond life itself. Because the same civilization that described the gods as builders, rulers, and war participants also described the Anunnaki as judges in the underworld, seated in assembly determining fate. There, too, the language remains procedural, structured, almost bureaucratic. Not vague spiritual dissolution, but court. And it is there, in the dark realm beneath life, that one of the oldest descent narratives reveals the Anunnaki in yet another stable role, not creators, this time, not instructors, but judges. The underworld in Mesopotamian thought is not heaven inverted into moral reward. It is not a place where the good are separated from the wicked, according to later theological standards. It is darker, flatter, stranger, more administrative. A place of dust shadow, diminished existence, a realm everyone enters. Kings and servants, heroes and commoners all descend, and in that realm, according to one of the oldest Sumerian compositions, the Anunnaki sit in judgment. Inanna's descent to the netherworld survives in multiple tablets and reconstructions. The story is well known in outline. Inanna descends through 7 gates. At each gate she is stripped of something: crown, ornaments, regalia, signs of power. Layer by layer status is removed. At last she stands before Ereshkigal, queen of the underworld, stripped and vulnerable. There, seated in assembly, are the Anunnaki. The text is severe. They fasten their eyes upon her, the eyes of death. They speak against her. They pronounce judgment. Inanna is struck, turned into a corpse, suspended. What matters for us is not only the drama, but the structure. The Anunnaki here are not diffuse spiritual background. They are judges, collective, seated, deliberating, exercising authority through procedure. They determine fate. That phrase recurs elsewhere too. To determine fate in Mesopotamian thought is not merely to express opinion. It is to fix outcome, to assign portion, to cut decision into reality. Once again, the divine behaves politically and administratively. And once again, the question returns from another direction. Why are the Anunnaki described this way so consistently? In some texts, they labor. In others, they receive relief from labor. In others, they sit in assembly. In others, they judge the dead. In others, they are tied to origins, foundations, the first ordering of the world. Their roles vary, yes, but their mode remains collective. They are a council, a body, a class. Not merely separate gods loosely grouped by later scholars, but an organized set with authority. This matters because the Mesopotamian divine world is not simple. It is not a single sovereign god speaking into emptiness. It is layered, contested, bureaucratic, familial. There are older gods and younger gods. There are assemblies and disputes. There are negotiations, decisions, punishments, assignments. Human political life seems mirrored in divine life with unusual consistency. One explanation is cultural projection. Mesopotamian city-states were governed by assemblies, councils, priesthoods, kings accountable within structures of rule. Naturally, the heavens were imagined the same way. Divine order reflected social order. That is plausible. But another possibility exists. Perhaps human political structures mirrored a remembered earlier structure attributed to the divine. As above, so below, or perhaps as below because once above. The Anunnaki, as underworld judges, appear in more than one text. They are not invented for a single scene. They recur whenever fate is fixed, whenever deep decisions are made, whenever the traffic between life and death is processed. Their authority seems almost older than kingship. Gods may rule cities. Shamash may be linked to justice. Enki may give wisdom. But the Anunnaki as a group persist at the deeper level of cosmic administration. Why 7 judges? Why an assembly? Why procedure? If all this is symbolic, why such specificity? The specificity does not prove historical memory, but it does prevent these texts from feeling like loose, dreamlike fantasy. They are structured. They carry institutional imagination. The underworld is not chaos. It is court. And there is something else here worth noticing. Mesopotamian afterlife judgment is not centered on moral character in the way many later traditions are. The Anunnaki do not function primarily as judges of virtue and sin. They determine fate more as an assignment of condition and status. The dead are processed into order. The language is almost administrative. This is cosmic bureaucracy. That may sound reductive, but it is deeply revealing. The same civilization that built records, quote as labor systems, and temple economies, imagined the afterlife as rule-bound, ranked, and governed. The underworld resembles the social logic of the world above. Again, that supports the projection theory. But it also supports another one. If the Anunnaki were remembered as organizers of civilization itself, then their continued role as administrators of life, death, destiny, labor, kingship would make sense within a more literal memory framework. They are the managers of systems. The judges because they are the governors. The governors because they are the founders. Whether that is mythology elevated into structure or structure remembered as mythology, is precisely the unresolved line. And this unresolved line keeps reappearing because the Mesopotamian record is too consistent to let us rest easily. The names remain, the functions remain, the imagery remains, the assemblies remain. The old stories do not drift as much as one expects. They are curated, preserved, repeated by scribes long after Sumerian ceased to be spoken as an everyday language. Why preserve so carefully? Because sacred tradition demands it. Yes, possibly, because it was considered historical. Possibly that too. This is not about forcing a conclusion. It is about refusing to simplify the evidence into certainty. The Anunnaki, as judges, also prepare us for a final crucial layer of the visual record attributes. Because whenever Mesopotamian art depicts these beings, it does not do so vaguely. It uses a stable code of identification. Horned crowns, rays, water streams, lions, wings, rod and ring. Distinctive features recurring across centuries. Such consistency can serve theology. It can also serve remembrance. And so the investigation now turns from role to appearance. Not what the texts say the gods did, but how the art says they looked, and whether those visual signatures feel more like symbols, more like descriptions, or most unsettlingly of all, like both at once. Look long enough at Mesopotamian art, and a pattern hardens into certainty. Not certainty about what the gods were, but certainty that the artists meant them to be recognized. Identification is precise, repeated, stable. A visual system spans centuries. Horned crown divine, rays from the shoulders, Shamash, water flowing with fish Enki, lion Inanna or Ishtar, rod and ring authority, justice legitimation, wings messenger mobility, heavenly rank, or some specific divine condition. This is not random ornament. This is structured recognition. One explanation, again, is straightforward. Religious cultures need iconography. Worship depends on knowing whom you address. Artists are trained to preserve attributes. Priests teach the code. Populations learn the signs. That is how tradition works. Yes. But if we keep the larger question open, another explanation remains possible alongside it. Such a system also resembles what happens when a culture believes it is preserving the appearances of distinct beings. Different figures, different attributes, different recognizable signatures. Description becoming standard form. Take the horned crown. In Mesopotamian art, it marks divinity with remarkable consistency. Sometimes fewer tiers, sometimes more, suggesting rank. Scholars read the horns as symbolic appropriation of bovine power, strength, fertility, majesty. That makes sense. Yet the crown is still a constructed object in the art not natural anatomy, a headdress, something worn. Could it have been only symbol? Certainly. Could it also preserve memory of distinctive ceremonial or technological headgear? It cannot be ruled out simply because the symbolic reading is stronger academically. The object remains depicted as object. The same tension appears with Enki's water streams. Symbolically, they are easy to read. Enki governs subterranean fresh waters, wisdom life-giving flow. Therefore, water emerges from him. Clear enough. But visually, the streams are not abstract signs floating nearby. They issue from shoulder level with fish swimming in them. The image depicts something happening. The descriptive quality is unusually strong. Again, symbol is likely. Yet the art chooses to symbolize through concrete, visual event. Shamash's rays work similarly. As sun god, of course, he is radiant. Of course, rays emerge. Yet the rays almost always appear from shoulder level in a standard pattern. They are rendered as part of his visible appearance. Texts describing divine manifestation also emphasize brightness, glare, difficulty of looking. Perhaps literary convention, perhaps theology of splendor, perhaps memory of luminosity attached to appearance. The possibilities overlap. Ishtar's weapons rising from her shoulders, her lion associations, her martial pose, so symbolic of war and dangerous sovereignty, yes. But again, the imagery is not merely conceptual. It gives the goddess a repeatable appearance. If a Mesopotamian viewer saw the form, recognition followed. This matters more than it may seem, because recognition systems emerge where identification matters. That is true in religion. It is also true in portraiture, heraldry, office, military rank, and record keeping. Then there are wings. Some divine figures have them, others do not. Wings can symbolize heavenly nature. They can signify messenger function. They can distinguish certain classes of being. They can also, if one allows the possibility, preserve the nearest available artistic vocabulary for flight or technological movement beyond ordinary human capacity. Ancient artists had no modern language for aircraft propulsion or engineered mobility. If something moved through the sky and was not bird-like, imagery would be the nearest translation. That does not make the alternative reading correct. It only means the symbolism itself may have arisen from a remembered visual problem. The rod and ring are another difficult case. Usually they are taken as symbols of authority, justice, legitimate rule, perhaps measuring tools transformed into regalia. That is a strong reading, and likely right in many contexts. But in art, they are held, given, received. Their materiality is emphasized. They are more than abstract concepts floating over a king's head. They are objects transferred in moments of authorization. Again, symbol and object are not opposites. A coronation crown is symbolic and physical at once. A scepter is symbolic and physical at once. The question is only whether these ancient objects also had practical functions, now lost behind the symbolic reading. And then there are composite beings, fish-cloaked sages, winged figures, human-animal hybrids. Here, mainstream interpretation rightly sees mythology, ritual costumes, symbolic beings, and divine servants. Yet even here, the border is not always simple. The Apkallu, for example, are sometimes shown as fish-cloaked human forms that can be ritual garb. It does not require fantasy biology. Over time, artistic shorthand may collapse costume into creature. An initial description may become literalized in image. This is how the memory often behaves. It condenses, it stylizes, it turns equipment into anatomy office, into essence clothing, into species. So when modern viewers look at ancient art and say, this is obviously mythological, they may be right. But they may also be overlooking how mythologization itself can preserve a transformed memory of something once taken as real. That is why the Mesopotamian visual record remains so difficult to reduce. The attributes are too consistent to ignore, too clear to dismiss, and too open to double reading to settle. A civilization that simply invented gods could certainly standardize their appearances. A civilization that believed it was preserving the appearances of beings once present could also do the same. Both explanations fit. And yet, when that standardized visual system is placed beside the standardized textual system, same names, same functions, same relationships, same recurring claims of instruction, judgment, labor, descent, kingship, architecture, the combined weight becomes harder to file away as casual myth-making. Not impossible, just harder. What we are looking at is not random fantasy. It is a coherent memory system. Whether the system preserves theology or history is still the unanswered part. And this is exactly where the alternative reading begins. Not as proof, not as a doctrine, but as a disciplined experiment in interpretation. What if, provisionally, one read the Sumerian material, not as mythology first, but as testimony first? What changes? What starts to fit differently? What anomalies begin to feel less anomalous? That is the question now. What if they were keeping records? Suppose, only for the sake of examination, that the Sumerians were not primarily inventing myths about the Anunnaki, but preserving testimony about them. Not proven testimony, not unquestionable truth. Testimony. What happens to the evidence then? First, the abruptness of early civilization begins to look different. Instead of assuming a missing developmental phase must exist somewhere below the archaeological horizon, the Sumerian claim of sudden instruction starts to align with the visible jump from settled village life to urban complexity. The city appears, writing appears monumental, building appears, administrative sophistication appears, and the culture itself says these capacities were given. In the conventional reading, that is explanatory myth. In the alternative reading, it is memory of technological and organizational transfer. Second, the ME stop feeling only like abstractions and begin to look like transmitted systems of knowledge. Writing kingship, craft, law, ritual order, architecture. These are not simply discovered by accident. They are transferred from divine keepers to human communities. When Inanna carries the me from Eridu to Uruk, the story can be read as political myth, yes, but also as relocation of civilizational authority and technical knowledge from one center to another. Third, the creation traditions alter in tone. In Atrahasis and related accounts, humans are made from clay mixed with the flesh or blood of a god. Mainstream interpretation reads this as symbolic anthropology. Humans are earthly matter with divine spark. A powerful reading. The alternative interpretation notices how procedural the language is. Materials are mixed. Bodies are formed. Gestation occurs. Labor needs are being solved. Humans are produced as workers to relieve the burden of the gods. Again, this does not prove genetic engineering or biological intervention, but it does mean the text is compatible with that reading in a way many modern readers are reluctant even to admit. The language is earthy, practical, almost technical, clay plus divine substance, forming, birth, function. Fourth divine human interaction becomes less like fairy tale and more like contact narrative. The gods appear in dreams, but with details. They give plans, they issue instructions, they wear distinctive attributes. They are bright, powerful, often larger, often associated with capacities humans do not possess. Kings claim descent from them. Heroes are called partly divine. Hybrid lineages become thinkable. Extraordinary stature and lifespan in early lists become, if not believable, at least legible within the logic of such a system. Fifth, the flood traditions shift. If one takes the Mesopotamian flood narratives as preserving memory of a real catastrophe, regional, civilizational, perhaps tied to dramatic environmental change, then the divine role in warning chosen survivors begins to look less like moral allegory and more like structured intervention. A destructive event comes. One human is warned. Specific construction instructions are given. A vessel is built. Life is preserved. Afterward, divine-human relations change. The gods become more distant. Human populations continue. That sequence matters because the king list also changes after the flood. Before it reigns are impossibly long. After it, kings become more recognizably human in scale. Mainstream readers see symbolic numerology. Alternative readers see a transition, a before time of different rulers, then a post-catastrophe age of ordinary dynastic history. Sixth, the sages before the flood. The Apkallu begin to feel less like pure mythological culture, heroes, and more like remembered teachers. They are associated with cities' knowledge, civilizing acts. Berossus, writing much later in Greek, but claiming access to older Mesopotamian traditions, describes Oannes emerging from the sea and teaching writing law crafts, agriculture. Mainstream scholarship reads this as late mythography, reasonably. But the consistency with earlier themes remains difficult to ignore. Civilization is taught. It arrives with teachers. Seventh astronomy becomes newly significant. The Sumerians and later Babylonians preserved detailed knowledge of celestial cycles. Venus periods, eclipses, planetary motions, calendrical coordination. Mainstream explanation credits careful long-duration observation, and much of that is surely correct. Yet the alternative reading asks whether some of this knowledge was transmitted rather than discovered entirely from scratch. If a culture repeatedly claims that heavenly beings taught them order measurement and timing, then their astronomical sophistication becomes part of the same pattern rather than a separate achievement. Eighth architecture becomes suspect in the old good sense of the word, worth suspecting deeper meaning in. Ziggurats are towers reaching upward, tiered mountains of brick. Temples are aligned, measured, consecrated. Plans come through dream. Sacred space is built for habitation by divine presence. Mainstream reading sees ritual architecture and political theology. Again, yes. The alternative reading asks whether these structures also encoded inherited technical systems whose origin the builders themselves attributed to non-human teachers. And then comes the hardest part, If one accepts even provisionally that the Sumerians may have been preserving a memory of contact with non-human intelligence, then many things that were once filed away as religious imagination begin to reorganize. Kingship lowered from heaven, gods teaching crafts, human creation for labor, direct intervention in war, councils of divine judges, withdrawal after catastrophe. A long cultural memory of a time when the gods walked more openly among humans and later became distant. It forms a coherent pattern. That coherence does not make it true, but it does make it intellectually serious enough to examine. And that is really the point. Not to declare the alternative correct, but to ask whether it explains certain features more elegantly than the standard model. The abruptness, the stability, the specificity, the repeated language of transfer, the persistent claim that civilization was not slowly invented but received. Still, honesty demands the other side be kept in view. The alternative reading requires an extraordinary premise that advanced non-human beings interacted with early human civilization and became the source of later divine memory. That is a large claim, larger than the evidence can presently prove. Much larger. We have compatibility, not demonstration, suggestion, not conclusion. So, the question becomes one of explanatory pressure. Which interpretation leaves fewer unresolved tensions? Does mythology explain the consistency and practical detail sufficiently? Does the contact memory reading explain them better? At the cost of introducing a premise current science does not accept. That is where the debate actually lives. Not in slogans, not in easy certainty, but in the pressure between two frameworks, each able to absorb much of the evidence, neither able to close the matter entirely. And once that pressure is acknowledged, another issue comes forward. The mainstream scholarly model, for all its rigor and immense value, still leaves certain anomalies sitting quietly at the edges of the record, not ignored exactly, but explained with a kind of confidence that may be stronger than the evidence deserves. Those anomalies deserve to be named, not because they prove the alternative reading, but because they are the places where the old questions remain most alive. Mainstream Assyriology is rigorous work. It gave us the texts, it gave us the grammar, it gave us the catalog numbers, the chronology, the philology, the excavated context, the translations without which none of this discussion would even be possible. That should be said plainly. There is no serious investigation here without serious scholarship first. And yet every framework, no matter how careful, has edges where it smooths more than it explains. One anomaly is the speed of urban complexity. The transition from Ubaid village society to Uruk-scale urban civilization still feels compressed. Streets administration, monumental architecture, labor organization, writing all visible within a comparatively tight archaeological window. The conventional answer is that earlier stages remain undiscovered, eroded, buried, or archaeologically invisible. That may be true, but it is still for now an inferred solution to an observed abruptness. A second anomaly is the speed of writing's development. Writing systems do evolve. They begin in simpler forms and become more flexible over time. Yet, cuneiform, across a relatively short, visible developmental span, becomes capable of immense sophistication. Administrative signs become a script system capable eventually of preserving literature, law, theology, mathematics, diplomacy. Again, the mainstream explanation is pressure, bureaucracy, innovation, genius, plausible. Yet the compression remains unusual enough to keep questions open. A third anomaly is the sophistication of the earliest surviving art and craft. The War Vase is not clumsy. Early cylinder seals are not hesitant experiments. The visual language arrives already coherent. This does not mean there was no earlier trial phase. It means the earliest surviving examples often look fully formed enough that we infer a lost preparatory history, because the surviving objects themselves already possess maturity. A fourth anomaly is the persistence of divine names' roles in iconography across deep time. Mythologies usually change more obviously than this. They do change in Mesopotamia as well, certainly especially across Sumerian, Akkadian, Assyrian, and Babylonian layers. But the continuity remains striking enough that one can reasonably ask whether the tradition was preserved with unusual care because it was treated not merely as sacred story, but as inherited account. A fifth anomaly is the technical language inside supposedly mythological texts. The Gudea cylinders give materials and logistics. Creation accounts speak in practical sequences. Flood stories specify dimensions and waterproofing. Ritual and architecture are described with precision. Even if all of this remains within religious literature, it is religious literature unusually saturated with procedural detail. A sixth anomaly is ancient astronomy. Mesopotamian observers were superb. That is beyond dispute. But the degree of precision, the long continuity of record, and the deep integration of celestial order into kingship ritual and architecture raise the question of whether observation alone is the whole story, or whether inherited systems amplified what was observed. The alternative reading sees heavenly teaching where the mainstream sees accumulated expertise. The evidence can still bear either interpretation. A seventh anomaly is the global recurrence of similar civilizational memories. Sky beings, floods, divine teachers, culture bringers, a golden age when gods or semi-divine beings walked among humans. Mainstream scholarship usually treats these as recurring myth patterns generated independently across cultures confronting similar existential problems. That is entirely possible, yet when the patterns become specific enough, teaching descent, flood withdrawal, the possibility of shared memory, however remote, remains difficult to kill completely. An eighth anomaly lies in language itself. Sumerian appears in written form already sophisticated. That may simply mean it was old before writing captured it. Probably so. But then one still faces the fact that a fully developed isolate language attached to the earliest urban civilization emerges into visibility, already functioning at high complexity. Again, not inexplicable, but not trivial either. A ninth anomaly is the repeated claim that civilization was given. Not developed, not discovered, not improvised, given. One can say this is exactly what myth does, and often that is true. But when a civilization says the same thing in text after text across many centuries, and when its visual record supports a world of direct divine human exchange, the statement deserves more than a shrug. And a 10th anomaly is numerical and chronological. The king list preserves reign lengths before the flood that strain ordinary historical understanding. Mainstream reading treats them as symbolic, likely correctly in some sense. But specific numbers, rather than vague ancient ages, suggest that whatever the system meant, it meant something precise to those who preserved it. The meaning may be lost, but the lost meaning itself is a problem worth respecting. Taken one by one, these anomalies can be explained conventionally, and often they are. But taken together, they create pressure. Not enough pressure to overthrow the mainstream model. Not nearly enough. But enough pressure to keep the alternative reading alive, as a question rather than dismissing it as fantasy. That matters, because too often the choice is presented badly, as though one must either accept every strange claim uncritically or dismiss the ancient testimony entirely as primitive imagination. Those are not the only options. One can do something harder. One can hold the evidence carefully, honor scholarship, acknowledge ambiguity, and still admit that the Sumerian record contains unresolved features. And perhaps the most honest unresolved feature is this: the Sumerians wrote as though the Anunnaki were real. Not psychologically real only, not poetically real only, real enough to name, describe, rank, depict, and preserve across generations. What exactly that reality was remains the question. The question remains because the evidence remains. The artifacts remain. The texts remain. The consistency remains. And because they remain, the investigation does not end in conclusion. It ends in pressure, in suspension, in a serious inability to say more than the evidence can bear. That may sound unsatisfying, but it is also where real inquiry begins. And so we arrive at the final movement of the script, not by closing the mystery, but by returning to it one last time, with all its weight still intact. The vault grows quiet again in the mind. The seal of Ada rests in its drawer. The War Vase stands in Baghdad, carrying its procession upward. The stele of the vultures remains against the Louvre wall, broken but not silent. Gudea's statues continue their stone prayer. The king list continues to name impossible reigns. The tablets continue to preserve words pressed into clay by hands long vanished. And the question remains: were the Sumerians myth makers, or were they record keepers? Were they imagining gods or preserving memory of others? Were they building an origin story because every civilization needs one? Or were they trying in the language available to them to tell the truth about how their world began? We have looked at the evidence slowly, at objects with catalog numbers and museum homes, at relief seal statues and tablets that can be checked, visited, read, and compared. We have looked at the way art and text align. The same beings appearing with the same attributes, the same names attached to the same functions, the same recurring claims of instruction, judgment, labor, kingship, architecture, and presence. We have looked at the old Sumerian insistence that civilization was received. We have looked at the possibility that this insistence was theological. We have looked at the possibility that it was historical memory, and we have not solved it. That is not failure. That is honesty. Because the truth is that both major readings still fit much of the material. The mythology reading explains the evidence without requiring extraordinary external premises. Humans create gods in human form. They project courts into heaven bureaucracy, into the underworld architecture, into revelation, and their own longing for order into cosmic narrative. That is plausible, more than plausible. It is deeply consistent with what humans often do. But the documentation reading also fits enough of the evidence to remain difficult to dismiss entirely. The abruptness of early civilization, the repeated language of transfer, the technical precision in supposedly mythic texts, the stable iconography, the deep preservation of names and roles, the flood transition, the sense throughout that the gods were not remote abstractions, but participants in shared space. We cannot prove that reading, but we also cannot honestly say the Sumerians themselves did not mean what they said. And that may be the deepest point of all. Ancient people were not fools. They were not confused children inventing stories because they lacked science. They were observers, administrators, builders, mathematicians, astronomers, writers. When they said that the Anunnaki came, taught, ruled, judged, and withdrew, they meant something. Whether what they meant was literal history, theological truth, ritual memory, or some fusion of all three remains unresolved. But it meant something real to them, something foundational, something worth preserving through dynastic collapse, language death, and millennia of burial. Maybe they were wrong. Maybe the Anunnaki were imagination disciplined into tradition. Powerful imagination, durable imagination, astonishingly consistent imagination. But imagination all the same. Or maybe they were not wrong. Maybe beings did come. Maybe human civilization was catalyzed. Maybe what later ages called gods were once experienced as others, powerful, luminous, demanding, instructive, physically present enough to be remembered, and then slowly mythologized as direct memory faded. We do not know, and perhaps for now, not knowing is the most faithful response to the evidence. Because mystery is not the opposite of thought. It is often what thought encounters when it reaches the edge of what can be responsibly said. So what should be done with this material? First, verify it. Look up the objects, read the translations, follow the catalog numbers. Let the evidence exist outside this narration. Second, read the primary texts where possible. Atrahasis, Inanna's Descent, the Gudea Cylinders, the King List, Gilgamesh. The old records speak more forcefully when heard directly. Third, resist the temptation of easy closure. The mainstream interpretation has strengths. The alternative reading has provocations. Both should be tested, not merely adopted for emotional comfort. Fourth, remain open without becoming gullible. High standards of evidence and openness to anomaly are not enemies. They belong together because new material continues to emerge. Tablets remain untranslated. Excavations remain incomplete. Technologies of imaging analysis and textual reconstruction improve. Future discoveries may close some of these questions. They may deepen them. They may reveal that what seemed impossible was simpler than expected, or that what seemed symbolic carried older memory than we knew. For now, the evidence waits, and perhaps that is why the subject endures. Not because it gives easy answers, but because it leaves a serious mind suspended between possibilities. Human civilization may be the product of ordinary emergence alone, astonishing enough in itself. Or it may also contain some deeper interruption, some catalytic event preserved as the memory of gods descending. Teaching ruling, then withdrawing. The Sumerians said the Anunnaki were real. Modern scholarship says they were mythological. The evidence, at least as we have traced it tonight, does not permit an effortless victory for either position. So we end where we began, but not in the same way. The seal of Ada still shows Shamash rising between mountains, Enki with his waters, other divine figures standing in relation, identifiable, composed present. The image remains, the question remains. Were they imagined or were they remembered? Perhaps that is exactly where the question should remain for now. Open, unresolved, alive. If these questions stay with you after the screen goes dark, that may be appropriate. Some investigations are not meant to end in a single night. Some are meant to remain with us to ask quietly for more patience, more reading, more comparison, more humility. The Sumerians left testimony. Whether that testimony is mythology, memory, or some ancient fusion of both, it still asks to be heard carefully. And somewhere in museum vault, in published tablet, in untranslated fragment, in earth, not yet excavated, more of that testimony may still be waiting. The mystery continues, the evidence remains. And whatever the truth ultimately is, it has not finished speaking.